Okay, so hello everyone. Welcome to day one of the Education Past, Present, Future event. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jo Symes. I'm the founder of Progressive Education, which raises awareness of alternatives to conventional schooling and campaigns for change. This event has been organised to celebrate the launch of a new course on alternatives to conventional schooling. I'll be telling you a little bit more about that later on in the event. But first of all, I'm delighted to introduce you to Kelly Rigg, who is the first guest speaker at our event today. We're going to be starting the event by looking back at the past. So, Kelly's going to be talking about how the school system in the UK came about. Kelly is the co-host of the Big Home Ed Conversations podcast, and she's also a coach. So, welcome, Kelly. Would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself and your
Yeah,
podcast and the work that you do?
absolutely. So I am a qualified neurodiversity coach, so ADHD coach, primarily. And I've also been kind of running the Big Home Ed Conversations podcast for the past couple of years. As a home educator myself, I'm extremely passionate about alternative education and trying to give us a different perspective on education itself. I kind of started home educating my kids right back when my son would have started school back in kind of COVID time. Obviously, a lot of us had realised that home education was an option back then, but I had no idea yet that he was ADHD autistic. But we did definitely notice that he was not coping brilliantly with nursery. And so choosing a different alternative education for him felt extremely important to make sure that he maintained his passion and his enthusiasm for learning and his own kind of identity as well, because he is a very, very unique, wonderful little boy. And he's, yeah, I think an awful lot of his quirks would have been a challenge in a classroom. Being perfectly frank, I have rescued teachers from the stress of trying to make that child sit down, because it would not have been easy. So yeah, so I ultimately am here today to talk to you guys about kind of mass schooling in from a really, really kind of nuanced level. So we're not bashing anything here. We're not saying anything is bad. But we're certainly considering kind of that relationship we've got with schooling and education here in the UK. And yeah, some of the stuff which has become a little bit too automatic a thought, and to really start to think about kind of what else we should be thinking as we go through this process. So yeah, hopefully we'll ask some interesting questions today and get you thinking.
Yeah, great. And just to say, if anyone has questions for Kelly while she's talking, feel free to put them in the chat, and then hopefully we'll have some time for a Q&A at the end.
For sure.
Okay, over to you then, Kelly.
Brilliant. Well, I'm hoping it's going to let me carry on clicking it now. I've got Zoom overlaying on it, but we'll get there in the end. Um, Basically, kind of really getting started. Obviously, you know a little bit about me now, but ultimately, we know that kind of mass schooling was scaling kind of education because it was optimizing for certain outcomes. Back then, leaders had some really serious problems on their hands, and we're going to really look into that and actually understand what kind of problems they were trying to solve and really what they were projecting their future to look like, what they were worried about. So I'm going to work really hard to kind of hold nuance in this. So I'm not going to be looking at it and saying that school is bad, that other opportunities are better, but we have got to really consider the structure that was created, and whether or not that is actually appropriate for our modern day. Because ultimately it's rooted in quite a lot of history. But I really wanted to start off by saying that number one, this is not a teacher bash. I really, really want to make that clear. As somebody who has opted out of mainstream education, I know that it could be assumed that I'm going to spend the next hour telling you all that schools are terrible. And I really want you to know that's not what I'm going to do. I know personally and professionally that many teachers are doing deeply caring, skilled work, and that they are operating under huge, huge, huge stress in a system that's under huge strain. I know there's a lot of constraints around accountability, curriculum demands, resources, all sorts of things. And so I'm very conscious of the fact that whilst schools can offer really amazing communities, safety, resources, adults who are super passionate about our children's outcomes, they are also operating with the kind of design of mass schooling that was not necessarily taking the individual into mind. It was much more focused on a generalized outcome. And so that's what we're going to really look into it today, and hopefully help to open people's thoughts around it. I'm very, very open to people commenting throughout. I don't want you to feel like you have to sit there and listen to me. You're welcome to challenge, to offer thoughts. Um, and I'm going to do my best not to get too detoured. As you can tell, I am nervous and I'm trying to pull myself together. We'll get there in the end. It'll be fine. Okay, so moving into the conversation. The key distinction. So, education versus schooling. Now, this is really, really important. Often we lump education in with schooling. Um, and ultimately, oh, thank you, Lindsay. I'm perfectly happy either way. I've actually hidden you all, no offense intended. So you're good. Um, but yeah, so okay, so yeah, education versus schooling. Often we lump education and schooling in as one thing. We don't really take the time to define it. And maybe this is true more so talking as a parent, and as an individual, just as the common man, someone who's just operating in this country that we're in. I've had an education via schooling. I've come out of it. I've led my life, and ultimately, I am definitely kind of looking at it and thinking, actually, ultimately, we are not thinking very clearly about education versus schooling. Education is bigger than any institution. Like, it's quite an obvious thing to say, but ultimately it's all of our learning. It's culture, it's the skills we build up, it's the knowledge of the world around us, it's the things we're passionate about, the stuff that would never have been taught in school, but we somehow know loads about. It's belonging, it's meaning, it's identity. It helps us to know who we really are and how we're going to affect the world that we live in. But schooling, if we want to be literal about the term, schooling in the context that we're going to explore today, which is kind of a westernized model, is a specific system providing some of our young people's education. So that's standardized, age batched, timetabled, measured, and governed. So it's a specific form of offering some of our children's education. Standardization of education isn't all bad. At the end of the day, it does bring some benefits. If a child was to move county, different area, they should, in theory, receive the same curriculum, the same level of expertise from the teachers that are teaching them. They should be in a situation that feels safe. They should get to be seen by other adults. And ultimately, without some shared metrics and ways to measure things, it's almost impossible to spot whether a school is doing a good thing or not, whether they are actually supporting a child or failing them. And when it comes to building alternative schools and understanding our different kind of perspectives, we have got to factor in like how can we ensure that the structures that we're creating are better, they are actually still providing a better environment. But this is, however, not in the full picture. Schooling in and of itself is a part of a child's education. It is absolutely so Annie's saying she can't hear. I'm hoping that's just you, Annie. Most people were saying they were commenting saying they were listening a second ago, but I'm hoping that's okay still. Um, great. Wonderful. Okay, everyone says they can hear me. So sorry, Annie, I'm not sure what's going on there. I'll mute yourself. Okay, cool. So yeah, so ultimately we have to think about this as a full picture. Kids will go to school. We know this is a huge part of their education, but most of the people at home will be also reading with their children, playing with their children, taking them for days out, going to kind of zoos and museums and festivals and all kinds of other experiences that will ultimately allow their children to develop passions and interests. They'll help to teach them how to change a tire. They'll help them to do their finances and learn how to invest and to get a mortgage one day. Like parents are a huge part of their children's education, as are the community that they grow up in. So it's not all about school. And this is something which, as we kind of put a lot of pressure on parents to be working full time and to kind of allow them to have a life of their own and to be able to still contribute to their community and have a community themselves, we quite often see a mismatch nowadays that really kind of demonstrates how difficult that is to actually uphold. But regardless, we need to start thinking about whether the current and historic standpoint essentially, what is it optimized for and what is it costing? So that's what we're going to try and explore over the next half an hour. Okay. School feels inevitable. It really, really does. It's literally like gravity. So for most of us, school feels like a completely natural fact. We grow up assuming it's simply what you do. You prepare your child for school, you celebrate the first day photos, you do the homework, you try to keep up. It's so ingrained in our society that ultimately we are really, really, really kind of like we're just so immersed in it. The normal routine of the day, the way that our holidays are all set up, when we're allowed to take a break, all of these things have been completely woven together. I mean, you still notice if you join a club as a grown up that it will typically run term time and it won't run during the school holidays. Like it's literally been an entire framework that's built for us to exist within. And essentially, we just grow up expecting it to be that way. Um, Oh, sorry. So when I've got two different computers going on here, it's hilarious. One for my notes and one for the this presentation. So it's hilarious. Keep going between the two. Um, so yeah, so we basically start to get to the point where when it doesn't feel right, when we have children that are not doing okay at school, when we've got anxiety going on, we've got behavior challenges, we've got sort of a family's needs or even their beliefs don't fit the mold, we just start to panic because rebelling against it and questioning it feels really wrong. It's been kind of very, very gently trained into us, but very thoroughly, that we shouldn't be questioning it, that we should just kind of be going along with the process. Um, and ultimately, when we don't question institutions, we've kind of been taught not to question institutions and we view them as an authority of human development. We then find ourselves feeling really at a loss as to how we're supposed to challenge it. Add to that the practical realities. We've got jobs to keep, we've got childcare needs, like to be able to have those jobs. For many families, schooling isn't just an education, it's a whole infrastructure that makes work possible. And that has huge class and gender implications as well. We all know that primarily women, being the primary caregiver in a family, their career is most affected by needing to choose alternative education for their children. That is still a fact today. Then we get told that there's a single gold standard, and we fear we're not qualified to offer that anyway. Despite having utilised the same education system we're trusting our children through, ultimately, we don't feel like we can deliver it. We don't feel like we have the authority to do that because we aren't teachers. We aren't trained to deliver it as an option. Then we add to it the overarching societal experiences founded in schools, so that the congruent memories, remembering the sports days, remembering the school plays, all these different things that help us to build this camaraderie with our fellow man. So we worry that our kids will miss out and feel like outsiders. The difficulty here is that it not only teaches us not to question it, not to challenge it, but to either endure it or to thrive within it. That we really only have those choices, it feels like anyway. So we tend to use it as a rule for how we grow up and develop. And likewise, it creates tension between schools and parents. We have difficulty advocating and systems that have difficulty flexing. So essentially, what we get into is this whole kind of feeling like we have to be a part of it, not necessarily wanting to sometimes, or not being able to sometimes, and then having all of these background fears and stresses that mean that we actually really struggle to provide us, well, our children with a nice grounded experience of education because we are not happy, they're not happy, and we don't really know how to support them if that is the case. Obviously, hopefully, there's a lot of children out there who are doing very well in that space. But the worst part about all of this, truly, is that children who live within the system have the least ability to influence it. So at the moment, obviously, children cannot vote. They can't set policy. Adults can overrule their observations, their needs, and their wants for their own good. Most of the media narrative in today's world paints modern children as lacking discipline, disengaged, more distracted, whilst we as adults continue to put them under huge stress. And we're reducing youth services, we're reducing their agency, we're increasing school, education participation age every once in a while, just to say we'll be in there for a little bit longer. Come on, stay focused on it. Now we're talking about potentially increasing maths and English all the way up to 18. These things continue to change. And ultimately, when we do this and we restrict their ability to influence the community in which they live in, and if we're just assuming that they're disengaged or badly behaved, then we tighten control. And that's really, when you look at the history and when we go to get into it further, some of the threads and the messages that have come from the very beginning really show us how leaders back then were very, very concerned about this. and wanted to make sure that we had some stuff in place to keep people behaving in a certain way. And we'll get into it in a lot more depth. But all of this to say that when we see school as being such a significant part of our community and our society, we have got to really consider what it is optimizing for and really what the consequences are. And we're going to keep coming back around to that. So that kind of brings us on to our guiding question. Who built mass schooling? What problem was it solving? And what did it quietly teach us, intentionally or otherwise? Now, we don't always start things the way that we wanted them to end up. So this is a really important thought. Human beings strive to solve problems all the time, every single day. Most people will probably spend most of their days solving their own problems, the problems of their employers, the problems of their local community. And ultimately, we try to tackle issues that we face, and the outcomes have far-reaching consequences that we never imagined and never factored them in. Sometimes because they exist in a futuristic world that was just beyond our imagination. So we couldn't choose, we just couldn't choose to make a better choice in that moment because ultimately we just didn't know what those things would be used for. Ultimately, you've got the fact that people will solve a problem with those consequences in mind, but because they wanted the profit or the credibility, or because the trade-offs felt reasonable, they've essentially decided to actually go ahead and do those things. A bit like the side effects on medications, if you think of it that way, as the idea of kind of if you make a medication that fixes a problem, it's likely to have side effects, but sometimes those trade-offs are reasonable. There's always a myriad of driving factors to solving a problem too. So you've got improving productivity, reducing effort. Like why do washing machines keep getting better and better at the end of the day? We don't want to wash our own clothes. Saving or making money, making someone or groups of people happy or satisfied. Even simply the act of achievement in solving the problem can be a driver as well. So there's all kinds of reasons why people are trying to solve problems. But if we look at the example of biscuits, when someone developed the concept of a biscuit, a hard, stable dough that has minimal moisture and keeps for long journeys, that's what it was initially back in history, that person never imagined that one day we would be baking 380 million of them every single day to feed a nation of 69.9 million people and millions abroad. And to then be contributing significantly to a worldwide crisis in high impact commodities like sugar, palm oil, wheat, and cocoa, high water use, habitat destruction, transport emissions, plastic waste, and damage to our health. But they just made a biscuit. Like it's really, they never imagined that all those things could possibly stem from that. But ultimately, it has gone on to produce quite a lot of harm to people and the planet. And we have got to be considering these things. So human innovation is littered with examples like these: lead in petrol, CFCs, so many different moments. But it's our job to consider and then learn from their mistakes. Did they do enough research? Did they have limiting beliefs or faulty logic that influenced their choices? Was it developed completely innocently or altruistically? Did they really not mean any harm by it at all? Did they have external pressures that meant the trade-offs were worth it? But really, they just needed to get the problem solved, even if it wasn't a great solution. Were they aware of the potential risks, but just ignored them? Possibly. So that leads us to today's guiding question. And it's good, isn't it? The biscuit analogy is really helpful. But essentially, this is where this question comes from. Who built it? What problem was it solving? And what did it quietly teach us? So education itself is a human constant. It wasn't invented, it was merely harnessed and utilized in different ways. So before school, humans were still learning. This is an obvious statement, and I know that, and I'm sorry, but they really, really were. It's basically, I once saw a post that said if we brought compulsory school age back to 1 year, how long would it be? How many generations would need to pass before we thought that school was required for a child to learn to walk? And it was a really thought-provoking question for me, and I really, really liked it. As a person who is a home educator and has seen my children learn to read and various other kind of amazing milestones. My son, for example, knows every single Greek god. and what they are the god of due to his own personal interest in the subject. Like, I've never had to teach him that. It's it really goes to show that a lot of the time, with minimal intervention and very little rote teaching, children will learn, and they will absolutely enthusiastically learn in areas that make sense for them and they can see as important to them and relevant in their lived experience. So ultimately, education is not something new. Like, we have absolutely always been doing it. But what is also quite concerning is, and whilst I'm sure nobody in this room would want to have this opinion, if we choose to look back at the belief that was created for us of what people were like pre-mass education, we don't really have a high opinion of them, do we? Being truthful, we see them as fairly ignorant, unruly, that they were constantly rioting, that they were just grubby people working down the mines. We haven't been built a brilliant opinion of who they were. And we saw them as illiterate, people doing very physical, less executive, or what we might consider intellectual roles. And I'm saying none of this to actually believe these things now. I'm being very, very brutal here. But ultimately, that is the image that we had created of us when we look back in history of people who needed education. They needed to have this education to have opportunity. But what we haven't really thought about is the fact that there was quite a lot of inventions and incredible developments made long before mass schooling came into play. If we look at things like mechanical clocks, telescopes, steam engines, printing presses, so many progressive ideas in all fields, from medical to industry to education, all of it developing long before mass schooling was a thing. Basically, we're looking here at often the common working men and women solving problems, improving efficiency, saving their employers and landlords money and time, increasing productivity, improving safety, and actually, surprisingly, a large majority of people were becoming to be literate towards the end of the 1800s. They were able to sign their own names. They were able to do very basic mathematics. They would have had Sunday schools teaching them to read. Um, and ultimately, these kind of practical understandings of numeracy, scientific principles, and the practical applications, and a multitude of other less appreciated skills, I'm sure, really actually encapsulates what people were like back then. These were innovative, capable people who knew the land. They knew how to take care of our planet. They were people who were way more conscious of the damage that their kind of impact could have. Um, and we've got to remember that a lot of the kind of wishing to get these people more executive and to be able to move into these higher roles was because we were trying to progress into an industrial era. So we can start to think that back then, everybody who was involved in the development of school was in the elite. That is an easy assumption to make, that ultimately it would have been the elite industrialists, the people who were kind of driving industry, that needed a disciplined and trained workforce who might have been making all the decisions. And we could easily assume that that is the case, but it's only part of the story. Essentially, back in this kind of early stage, kind of we're talking 1800s and onwards, there was an awful lot of charity schools, Sunday schools, workhouse schools, lots of clergymen combined with men and women in their communities trying to help the masses with their education. So there was an awful lot of and also childcare and welfare as well. So there were people who were actually offering numeracy and literacy and other subjects. And they obviously would have also been learning through apprenticeships and trades opportunities as well. So developing skills in their community. And really what started to happen was, as people started to, as they started to shift into cities and start to take on more industrial roles, realistically, we started to have some problems. And this is where the monitorial system came into play. So it's actually developed by the son of a shopkeeper and a clergyman. Two random people. One was over in India, it's a Scottish clergyman who's working over in India, and one that was based in London. And we're talking about Andrew Bell and Joseph Lancaster. So these are two gentlemen who both really believed that it was actually morally wrong that the poor were not receiving an education, that they really believed that it was absolutely not okay. Um, However, and this is the however, although they were more closely linked to the common man and had the common man in mind, they were also still very religious, very socially and politically motivated. And they both prioritized the concept of having an education in place that prioritized moral formation, so religion, prioritized producing compliant, industrious citizens, so people who behaved, followed the law, and were part of a mass kind of intention that they were still believed that it was important if we're going to teach the poor, then we need to make sure they're all talking and singing off the same hymn sheet. So what's quite difficult here is whilst they were quite altruistic, they cared an awful lot about the common man. They really didn't like the fact that there was a lot of children in work, and they really wanted to make sure that people were getting a good education and given more opportunity. They also didn't necessarily have fully altruistic beliefs. And this is not necessarily to believe that they were villains. We all operate within our own limiting beliefs and the things that we have been taught to believe. And realistically, they both had their own experiences and they're both lived experiences and what they were witnessing and seeing. And they were obviously seeing a need for this kind of schooling to come into play. Now, the monitorial system is quite simple. Teachers would teach older students, and then those older students would teach larger groups of younger students. That essentially, so the older students were the monitors. So they would teach them and then they would teach down. This is very rote learning, didn't offer much opportunity for creative thinking. It was much more, this is what we're learning about, this is what you're taking in information wise, and did rely strongly on discipline and a strong structure. So this is kind of a very early form of our mass schooling now, but was a method that was scalable and cheap and made it much easier for them to roll it out over wider areas and to help a lot of children at once. But they aren't the only people in amongst the working classes who have been staunch advocates of education being provided to the masses. Formerly enslaved individuals, for example, who also went on to found schools. Working class families too wanted better chances of employment. They wanted to avoid exploitation. They wanted to manage their money. They wanted to be able to actually read their contracts. They wanted to be able to actually progress their own future. And society was becoming more and more bureaucratic as well. And they needed to know what they were talking about. They needed to be able to fight for their rights, to understand the law, and to be able to protest and to argue with Parliament. And these are all things which they did feel that they needed an education to be able to do. But so whilst not everyone agreed on the form that schooling should take, many reformers argued that education was necessary for citizenship, to understand our laws, to organise us collectively, and to argue for representation. That ultimately, the difficulty is that whilst many reformers were strongly altruistic, reform wasn't always easy. This wasn't always something which felt accessible to most people. Leading us on to a very strong statement, but power rewards compliance. It's not a conspiracy. I promise I'm not going to go crazy for you here, but there is definitely an institutional logic to it. So between the monarchy, churches, and other religions, as well as the state religions, state traditions, history is littered with examples where conformity equaled safety and dissent equaled risk. So those in charge have always had a very important job to do. We have to keep people in check or on side. This, depending on the type of leader you are, could mean mass executions, or it could mean the abolition of slavery. It just very much depended on the person who is in charge at the time. As monarchy has made way for government, so that's very much kind of during the 1600s, we moved from a country that was led by the whims of a monarch and instead had a governing parliament. However, the governing parliament was still only voted in by the elite, by noble men and women, or noble men, obviously, not women. But this is a group of people who essentially lived in a very different world to the common man. They wouldn't have experienced a lot of the things that we were experiencing, but they did obviously speak for us. Now, in the 1800s, things started to shift, but it was only about 1884 when most men, and I'm not even all men, but most men could actually vote and influence political policies. So that was after compulsory schooling for the masses was enacted, about 14 years after. And so essentially, we are looking here at a group of people who have had a government decide that the type of education they should receive is X before they have had a chance to even have a say in government policy. So that's not really ideal, as you can say. But once you've got a system in place, you have then got to try and fight back against it. So at this point, it's in place, it's been put into law. And now the people have got to do something about it. They've got to stand up for what they believe in, and start to say their part. But working men and women who disagree with parliamentary decisions took huge risk in protesting. It could easily be seen as rioting or sedition, and the state's core fear was disorder. In rapidly growing industrial towns, we had seen huge increase in population, millions in increase, which meant that they were dealing with a lot more people and not a lot of structure to actually keep them in check. So they were genuinely terrified that even if grievances were legitimate and they started to protest against things, it would be policed quite strongly. There was an act called the Six Acts, for example, in 1819, which restricted large meetings and radical publications. So sort of there's very little recourse with the government back then. People would have had to really fight to get noticed. But if we think about, so I mean, one of the examples of a time sort of back then, a little bit later, but it's all women's suffrage. We know a lot about women's suffrage. We see it as something which is quite awful when we think about the things that those women went through to be able to get the vote, that men were doing the same not that long before it, that really only 20 years before that they managed to get the vote. So like they really had been fighting hard for this for a long time. Even today, and this is the thing that we have to be really conscious of, even today with things like the passing of the Children's Wellbeing in Schools Bill and attendance fines, etc., we see examples where as parents, compliance with the institutional values and goals is being policed. So despite many reasoned, intelligent arguments around the efficacy, the safety, the intention of these things, it is still something which we are having to challenge in today's world. And ultimately, this is where we have to be careful about how much power we allow the government to take over education, because it can affect an awful lot of things. So, oh, thank you, Annie, that's very kind. So, rightly or wrongly, institutions such as schooling inherit the values, the fears, and the goals of the systems that fund and govern them. So, that's just a fact. Ultimately, schooling, compliance, such as routine, normalizing surveillance, ranking, normalization of individuals having to be whole like square peg, square peg, square peg, is rewarded not only through punishment or permissions, but also through access. So schooling and later credentials become the gatekeeper to work, respectability, social acceptance. It can define us thoroughly, both in the eyes of others and in our own eyes as well. Most people I know will spend an awful lot of their life putting themselves down and not feeling like they're up to things. But ultimately, if we don't feel qualified enough, we won't stand up and talk about things. We won't advocate for ourselves because we assume that we're not educated enough. Even why I'm nervous today, right? Because like just talking to you guys about this, it makes me nervous that I'm not educated enough to be able to talk to you about it. So essentially, this means that institutions do not merely prefer conformity, they quite literally structure life chances around it. And this is what we have to be really careful of. So even well-intentioned reform, when working within the systems and social conditioning of the time, can still reproduce the values of the system it's trying to improve. And that's what we have to be really careful of as we try and build alternative education and options, is to really consider what our conditioning has been, our limiting beliefs, the things that we are worried about, and ultimately try not to reproduce the same values. So, the industrial turn, a new problem to solve. So, by the late 1800s, being fair to leaders, they were under huge pressures. So, society was being reshaped at immense speed, even if some of the problems are the ones they made themselves. Let's face it, they're the ones who made the factories, and they're the ones who have obviously developed all of these technologies and stuff that have caused the issues. But bless you. Um, okay, so industrialization was in full force. So the UK was trying to secure and extend its position as a leader in the world, like commercial and imperial power. So we were trying to expand manufacturing and trade, we were trying to maintain social order, and we're trying to compete militarily and economically with global rivals. So it was very important for the government and for industry leaders, who are all kind of somewhat intermingled at this stage in life, for them to actually have some thought around education, because it was changing hugely. Rural livelihoods were under threat, so mechanization, new energy sources were making production more efficient and cheaper, but losing jobs. We really were in a pickle. Like, we had lots and lots of people being born because obviously agriculture and increased medical provisions, etc., were all a good thing. Sanitization, water systems, all of it was getting better. People were surviving. That meant numbers were rising, and there weren't enough jobs. And so people were heading into the cities. And these cities were growing so fast, so fast. And essentially, they couldn't keep up with the housing and sanitation, the demand that came with. The houses situation was dire, and urban poverty was becoming a real problem. So, overcrowded housing, poor sanitation, disease outbreaks, insecure work, high child labour, which is causing unrest and dissent amongst the working class because they were unhappy. People were really not happy with how the country was being run. And as such, reformers obviously started pushing for schooling. They wanted schooling for so many reasons, but some of them were genuinely protective ones. They wanted people in poor conditions to have better outcomes. They wanted to reduce child labour. They wanted to widen literacy and opportunity. They wanted people to stop being exploited. They wanted other people to have the educational ability to solve some of the problems that we were now facing. The increased need for medical support, the increased need for better housing. They needed innovators, they needed people to be thinking and to working hard, to solving the problems, not just operating within it. So that obviously drove it massively. Alternatively, another side of it you can think about is the fact that actually other countries were also starting to adopt mass schooling. So Germany, France, the USA, all countries that the UK, they're rivals supposedly of the UK, they're absolutely countries that we would want to meet their progress where their progress is at. So if they're putting these things into place, we would just think, oh, well, maybe we should be doing the same thing as well. Another factor is churches. So at this time, churches had the monopoly on education and people relied on them, but they decided what they taught. And what denomination of Christianity they were influenced this greatly. So as communities became more diverse, and obviously we became more relaxed and open to more religions actually being able to exist, kind of cohabitate in a country and exist, really an argument that schools should be more universal became a driving factor for state schooling too. But this also had obviously detriment to people who were religious, because if schools were going to have a more universal approach and be less religious, that meant that potentially their children were going to be taught things that they didn't agree with or went against their family values. But in the end, mass schooling was a system to gather children daily, standardize learning, and measure outcomes. And that has the potential to make a changing population more governable. So that's really what was happening here. It was people starting to think, how do we solve this problem? How do we actually get people um, educated enough to solve some of these problems and to actually contribute to our workforce? It's not an easy problem to solve. So if we did it over, and I guess that's what we're really thinking about here, Would we have done anything differently? Knowing the constraints, the beliefs, the experience of living back then, what would we have done differently? Um, Feel free to comment on it as we go through this because I've got some questions I'm going to put to you and you can think about the answers if you have thoughts on them. So just think for a minute that you are the leader of a world leading country. So your population has grown from 16.8 million in 1851 to an astounding 30.5 million in 1901. So we have doubled in population in 50 years. Food supply and nutrition has improved. We've got cleaner water, we have sewage systems, we have a better understanding of sanitization and disease transmission. We now have vaccinations against smallpox. We have better medical care. But you have the considerable problems that we've mentioned before. So we've all got these things going on. Yes, it definitely does feel like we're going backwards at times. um, but you have all these considerable problems. So what do we need to work hard to remember? Who were the innovators who got us here? So let's just think about that for a second. We've got all of these massive improvements without mass schooling, without that opportunity. But a lot of these solutions were developed by the common man. So we've got all of these solutions to these problems that we are facing as an economy, as an industry leading country. A lot of this was already happening. A lot of positive change was already in motion. What did we risk losing by putting something like mass schooling in place? Religion, culture, rural communities, physical health, mental health. A lot of us sitting down doing jobs that were quite dangerous, like often kind of being exposed to various poisons, not very nice experiences. Like we're definitely looking at people here kind of really experiencing a lot of damage, but also mental health. Like, let's face it, nowadays the talk is a lot about mental health, how damaged we feel by the experiences that we've had in our lives. How else could we ensure that we still get mass literacy and numeracy, the law? How else could we have educated? How else could we have offered that to people? Nowadays we have the internet and we have technology and AI, which is a wonderful thing if you're in that kind of market. We can get the answer to a question in seconds, no matter what education we've had before. But that wasn't the case then. Why is literacy and maths important? Why have we put it on a pedestal? Why is it considered to be one of the most important things that we offer our children? But also, what else is important that we haven't offered our children? What other subjects have we not covered? Something like 4.5 million books get published every year. Different perspectives, different ideas, different thoughts. How much of that is adopted into the curriculum that we face now? Yes, a community. Yeah, exactly, like it was. Maybe the system wasn't so broken after all. Maybe we could have actually allowed for some self-governance. What moral beliefs should we have based it on? What rules did we want to have still? Like, do we like all the rules from religion? Maybe not all of them, but we could have chosen some moral values. We could have had some say in it. What do we like about our society now, and what don't we like? There's a fair amount I still don't like, if I'm honest. A lot of it taught through this process. Should religion play a part in our education? If not, then is it fair to ask those who have deeply religious beliefs to accept a curriculum that denies those beliefs? Probably not. Can the masses be trusted to learn? Trusted. That's the word here. Trusted. Or even to educate without governance. Why weren't they trusted? What could have built trust and abated leaders' fears aside from control? A bit like nowadays, we're taught to parent with collaboration over correction, right? That kind of connection over correction. That's what I was looking for. Sorry. Collaborating on solutions, asking their opinions, working with them. Did we just need to be controlled? Was that really the answer? I will come back to people's thoughts in a second. I'm not ignoring you. How else do we reduce child labour and exploitation without losing the opportunity and purpose that apprenticeships and skilled work offered young people? We see it as child labour as all being God. Oh, I read the word God then. All being, I've lost my train of thought now. Yeah, we kind of look at the idea of kind of doing purposeful work, like having opportunity, like child labor. That's what I meant. So sorry, I got there in the end. So yeah, child labor is all considered wrong. That sounds quite controversial to say this. My 9-year-old desperately, desperately wants to get out there and start doing things and contributing and learning skills that he is age blocked from participating in. A lot of it he will not be allowed to do until he is 14 or older because of insurance and child labour laws. So his intentions, his wish to do things is blocked by the very laws that are there to protect him. And sometimes I don't like that. Sometimes I wish that he could go out there and start doing those things because he wants to. And it would massively benefit his education to start getting into them now. Many of the people who built the 19th century advances were educated through a blend of either privilege or apprenticeship and self-study. So less sit still and be tested, more tinker, read, argue, build, which really makes the question worth asking: what environments best protect curiosity and deep focus? What do we want our children's values to be? How do we want them to affect the world they live in? But can we actually solve all these problems with a one-size-fits-all option? Is a standardized education the answer at all? How do we offer alternative options whilst maintaining that congruence with society and helping our children to still succeed within the confines of the expectations around qualifications, etc.? These and so many more questions. So I'm getting goosebumps just reading my own questions here, just thinking about some of these things as I'm talking about them. But if you can imagine just for a second what it's like as a leader of a country with millions of people that you are trying to govern, whether you are a good leader or a bad one, whether you care or you don't care, whether you're making kind of choices that allow children to succeed and to thrive and to come up with great solutions and innovate, whether that was your intention or whether it wasn't, ultimately, we'll never really know how altruistic or intentional the beliefs and arguments of people back then was. But we can hope that some of what they created was done for a reason. So we can kind of quite easily say here that school structure teaches lessons, but what lessons lie beyond the curriculum? So I'm going to come back to your comments when I do the Q&A bit at the end. We can discuss it a bit further. There's so many there. I couldn't possibly keep up with them all. I'll get sidetracked for ages. Okay. So it isn't something that we need to argue that the structure our modern day schooling is built on has strong roots to these early industrial problems. Bells and timetables helped people get used to the concept of external control of attention. Stop and go on demand. Punctuality. Not deep focus. We want you to do this bit, and then we want you to do this bit. We don't want you to stay in something for too long. Age grouping emphasizes standardized expectations. So it basically helps it make it easier to scale the concept, to train teachers and inspect schools. But it also helps us to help children understand what is expected of them at certain ages. And it helps them to understand like the hoops to jump through. Curriculum targets encourage compliance with prescribed shared knowledge. So social cohesion. We want everyone to believe the same things. We want them all to work together. We don't want loads of people pushing back and causing us issues. Tick. Taught from the front methods create hierarchy and a deference to authority. You know more than me sensation. So that minimizes questioning and leadership. It basically causes us to take this further into our world and to see anybody else as an authority over us when they know more than us. It stops us from feeling like equals and feeling like we can challenge that. Testing and grades train us to seek extrinsic motivation. Giving a man to fish. So yeah, sorry. So I'm thinking where giving a man to fish saying fits into all of this. Absolutely. So yeah, testing and grades train us to seek extrinsic motivations. This is the concept of motivation that comes from outside of ourselves versus intrinsic motivation, which is when we want it. We want to do it and we will do it because we want it. Ranking heightens competitiveness. That amongst the elite was what drove industry and power dynamics. So to them, it probably made a lot of sense. that with competitiveness, you breed people trying harder to do better. But actually, a lot of this can obviously have its downsides. Behavior systems like sticker charts, pen licenses that we see today, all influence rote obedience. Obviously, behavior systems back in the 1900s was more cane, but we'll get into that later. This trains deference to authority and to society. So it's a harsh viewpoint, but bear with me, being a bit cruel at this point. So, how did it evolve? Like, what would we have done? So, if we look at how mass schooling has evolved in the last 150 years, you can see how public opinion, politics, um, science, and reform have all influenced its progress. So, in 1870, that's when the Forster Act came into play. That is considered to be when compulsory schooling, or as we know, is actually compulsory education, not schooling, first truly started evolving. But it was 1880, with the passing of the Elementary Education Act, that made educational attendance compulsory. So, with local enforcement. So, they would have actually had parents kind of knowing that they needed to send their kids to school. So, whilst it was considered compulsory, though, there was still major pushback from the masses at this stage. So, parents needed the income from their children brought in from working or needed help on their farms. The actual school year um, is actually all based around the farming calendar. I don't know if anyone's ever noticed this, but depending on the region, the school would start back in September, October when the harvest was finished. They could not force rural families to send their kids to school during the summer. They just couldn't do it. It didn't matter how hard they tried. The government could never force them to get over that and to do it. So school holidays literally fall around the concept of the farming calendar, even today. Like it hasn't changed. It's stuck as it is, which is fascinating to me. There's all sorts of things that just link to different things. Um, so back then as well, schooling wasn't free. Like parents had to pay for it. So even though it was compulsory, they had to pay for it. So in 1891, elementary education became free. So this is primary age as we would know it now. Fees were abolished for state schooling, a major shift in ensuring mass adoption because most people then are like, oh, okay, well, you've given me the childcare and you've given me the education, and now I don't have to pay for it. So now we're talking. And you might even find that a lot of people back then really welcomed it, that it may have been seen as huge progress. But what we also have to recognize is that they also handed away a huge chunk of their power, or really had it took from them because they didn't have the right to vote on it otherwise. Um, and so we might have celebrated it in some cases because it felt like a relief, but actually it wasn't necessarily back then. In 1902, local education authorities were established. So that allowed not only more local governance, so local authorities could obviously work to understand the needs of their local community and schools and could better fight for their needs and funding. But they could also help to keep a better eye on attendance and adoptions and outcomes and keep track of it and help to police it better. So ultimately, good and a bad thing again. In 1905, early intelligence testing concepts started to evolve. And I won't go into this too deeply, but essentially, it all sits very uncomfortably close to eugenic thinking, sort of Hitler situation. There's an awful lot of knowledge back then. There's an awful lot of understanding around evolution, the concept of survival of the fittest from our lovely Darwin, that was basically turning thoughts into understanding that human potential could be boiled down to a single number, essentially IQ tests. That would justify sorting and actually offering an unequal opportunity for learning to different people depending on their intelligence levels. In 1906, school meals and medical inspections came in. So this was establishing schools as a welfare or public health benefit alongside education. Um, gosh, I'm just seeing the time. Someone should have poked me really hard. I've gone on for ages. But yeah, so this all kind of goes on and on. Honestly, I had no idea how to keep an eye on that. So all of the kind of reward and punishment stuff starts to come into play. And then we have obviously school leaving age rises consistently over time. And then we also have the kind of the policy shifting to make kind of secondary schooling more comprehensive and non-selective. So we start to get away from things like the 11 plus, or they tried to get rid of the 11 plus. Corporal punishment was finally banned in 1986. So it's quite late, really, in the grand scheme of things. Joe, have you got another talk on straight after me? Do I need to wrap things up?
No, there's nothing on until 8 o'clock tonight.
Oh, great. So if
Do you
anybody's
need to
happy to put
go?
up with me, no, I don't need to go. So I'm happy to carry on.
Okay.
I'm really sincerely apologetic. I didn't pay attention to the time. I honestly thought I was doing great for time. I literally just looked at it and gone, oh my God. You can see how passionate I get about this. I can't help myself. I do apologize.
You're
Um,
doing great, Kelly. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody who wants to stick around and keep listening. So thank you for your patience with me. Um, I know it's a lot. It's a lot of information, so I don't want you to miss out on the information. If I had to rush, that's good. I don't need to rush. Okay, I will try and get through it though. So essentially, what's happened gradually over the course of the 1900s is that they were increasing the school age. They were trying to make education more cohesive. They were trying to make it less like grammar schools and separate secondary schools and technical schools. They wanted to bring people together to make it easier and easier and easier to provide one set standard for everyone. And it was only really in 1988 that we actually started to get the national curriculum, standardized key stages and testing and league tables, and basically allowed the government to finally have that clear, defined message. As we know, is still not really something which works particularly well, but ultimately they finally had something in place. Um, we also then obviously had things like the academies expansion starting. So that allowed for schools to have more autonomy from their local authorities and actually started to give us some more of these opportunities to shift the context of what was actually happening in schools, so that children could have an alternative. Oh, bye everybody. I'm so sorry those of you had to go. We're going to catch up on the last little bits on the recording. So but yeah, so that's the gist. I'm trying not to get too distracted by the chat. Is as academies started to come into place, we actually started to see some schools being able to take back some of their power and be able to actually provide a much better kind of it's an opportunity for them to deviate a little bit and to come up with things that actually support their community and their kids in their area. So this is something which obviously the current government are wobbling about at the moment, which is an interesting thing to notice. But if we look at how it's evolved over the last kind of 150 or so years, we've gone from a patchwork of voluntary provision into a universal state organised system. Compulsory attendance, which we all know is not literally compulsory. We can absolutely have different forms of education. We got free access, we got welfare support, we got a national curriculum, and we got Ofsted and all the different things that come into play to try and make it safer and better for people. But whilst the concept of education has been studied by many scientific fields, improving our understanding of child development and learning, the fact that policy decisions for schooling are driven as much by politics, budgets, and accountability pressures, we actually don't see an awful lot of focus on developmental science. The politics and the budget and the accountability is what drives it. And the developmental science is often used as a way to kind of reinforce beliefs around something, and to back up their statistics. So in recent decades, the emphasis has shifted again towards professional accountability, testing, new governance models, raising standards, but we're not really looking still at the kind of enduring questions about who the education serves and sort of who's controlling it and what outcomes we're prioritizing. So the modern benefits and the consequences, we can argue that in the last 100 or so years, mass schooling has aided mass literacy and numeracy, qualifications being available to more individuals that can open doors beyond family background, safeguarding and visibility, potentially. I can certainly comment on that in a moment. We've also got the fact that we've got school meals and welfare support, shared civic knowledge, social mixing, access to specialists and resources without further cost to the parent, identification of special educational needs when done well, relief for parents and carers to allow them to work or to rest, and community. So much of this is considered a fact. Like there's that schools are responsible for these things. And I'm asking you to consider for a moment whether all this would have been possible without mass schooling. So, could we really not have provided the resources and experts to our children in any other ways? Apprenticeships, real world applications, for example. And also, did we not have strong communities and social mixing before schooling? So, across all ages and in many varied situations to allow for different kinds of social expectations. So, how much of this didn't actually already exist and realistically has just been harnessed and put into a system, and we've been told that the only way that we can access it now is to use schools. So we also have to consider that some of the benefits here are about supporting the school and the structure itself, and not necessarily for the children. Some are for the children, but some are for the school. And if mass education was built differently, could it have been more optimized for the children? So let's consider the consequences. Credentialism, or the paper ceiling. So life chances tied to grades more than demonstrated skill, and the societal kind of diminishment of practical skill-based roles over executive or intellectual ones. So we've got people here who, like I know that when I was growing up, it was very much drilled into me that those people who would get high grades would go on to more intellectual roles, would earn more money. That if you wanted to do an apprenticeship or a more practical career, that actually a lot of people didn't have very high opinions of those individuals. Schools put children in the view of other adults and can spot concerns, but when we have historically taught children that good equals compliant, it can make it harder for children to disclose harm, especially when the harm comes from an adult within the system or one who has control over their day-to-day life. So without wishing to drastically oversimplify what is a very complex issue around safeguarding, we know that schools are not always safe for our children. Then we have mental health and stress normalization, chronic pressure, performance anxiety, burnout patterns learned early, external validation dependency. So this sort of lack of ability to self-direct and to not need deadlines or approval to be doing things. Risk aversion and fear of failure, perfectionism or hiding mistakes. Mass schooling became a route to rights and assessments and specialist support for some children who would previously have been invisible, and the same system can also pressure children to mask and pathologize sort of the difference in them, and to exclude ones that can't easily be served, amongst so many other things. So to close and to offer you my thanks for your patience, as I clearly have terrible timekeeping skills. I did mention that I have ADHD, right? I want to just kind of come back to good faith. I don't think that mass schooling came from a room full of villains. I really don't believe that everybody who was involved in the decisions only had kind of intentions to make us kind of all compress and do as we're told and to just follow the party line. As a passionate home educator, this is a sensation I've had in the past before I have thought critically about it. But in a time of rapid industrial change and poverty and huge population growth, a shared school system was, in some ways, a genuine attempt at fairness, to reduce child labour, to raise literacy, and to create safeguarding, and to give every child something, not just privileged. So there are for sure some individuals at the core of it, like there are today, who had limited individual beliefs about what education should look like and what we should be learning about in order to kind of keep order and to how to benefit employers, and what the gold standard is, or those who would have had personal motivations. So primarily sort of industry leaders and wealthy individuals obviously would have all had their say, just like they do today. But whilst they had a huge influence on schooling, and they would have still done, like even today, we have big industries having huge influences on schooling, it would have been an incredibly difficult thing to build, and something which would have had to go through so many millions of iterations. And as we know, with the constant shifting political parties, we have constantly shifting dynamics and values and opinions. That means that we are constantly fighting to get fairness. So it's not easy to create a system that actually benefits all. And essentially, when you're producing something en masse, you're naturally rewarding what's easiest to organize, to measure routine, punctuality, adherence to rules, testing based on memorization of standard answers. These are useful life skills, and they can also quietly crowd out agency and that sort of deep curiosity and the needs of children who don't thrive in that one size fits some format. So it's really easy to see that how intentions aside, the members of parliament and reformers of the 1800s really could never have dreamt the way that education looks now. And with a country of nearly 70 million individuals, with all kinds of different faiths, backgrounds, wisdoms, technology, there's no way they could have actually figured out what would serve our future now. So that's our job. And as much as we can be angry or fed up or annoyed with the way that it has been created, we have got to start separating education from schooling and start to remember there are other ways of doing this and to ask better questions. Like, who is it optimizing for? Who does it serve well? And who does it ask to adapt or mask or fall behind? What would it look like to design learning around human development and nervous system safety and genuine meaning? What human innovation might that lead to? And essentially, that's all I really want for you to be thinking about off the back of this, is to just make some room for agency, choice, real projects, student voice, nervous system safety, movement, sensory needs, less testing, and broader success signals, caring about the contribution, the community learning, the things that kids are actually doing all by themselves. And ultimately, widening the definition of what education can be, making a bit more room for children to flourish. Thank you. That's me done.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Kelly. That was fantastic. What a brilliant, succinct history that you've put together. And you asked some
Extinct.
really
Do we manage to extinct?
thought-provoking questions. Well done. Amazing. Are you in a rush? We've had
No, no.
3 questions.
I'm not in a rush now. I can absolutely stay
Okay.
and answer questions. Thank you all for being so patient.
So John O'Reilly had a question. I don't know if
Mhm.
John's still here. If you are here, would you like to unmute and ask your question? And if you've gone, maybe we can scroll up and find it and you'll get it on the replay. Where is it? Or maybe we'll move on to Alice's question if John isn't here. Hang on. So
I'm
Alice
happy to
said,
I'm happy to answer it if necessary. Then you can always listen to it on the recording later. But
I can't find it now. I just had a little scroll up. Let's move on to Alice's.
okay.
So she says, what do you feel the purpose of education should or could be if there was a magic wand to solve some of the barriers to providing a more progressive approach to education? What do you think a national curriculum or approach to education could look like?
Mm.
Any thoughts on how we can create a system where every child, no matter how complex their needs are, can belong? So maybe should we start with the first bit? What do you
Mhm.
feel the purpose of education should be?
I personally feel the purpose of education should be allowing an individual to develop what they can see is important into something. It sounds so simple, and I get that that's kind of a bit vague, but the truth is that there are a million and one problems that need solving on this planet right now, and we experience our community and our lived experience in our different kind of areas of the world. And obviously, we've got people from all over the world listening now. That ultimately you have got problems in your community, your society, things that bother you, your family, your environment. All these things need attention. And when we prioritize a curriculum and asking children to focus in on things that we're telling them they need to pay attention to, and we stop them from being able to just explore the world around them and notice things, then actually we kind of limit the potential for them to see real problems, real things that are happening, the real consequences of stuff that we have done, and actually do something about it. I personally just believe that the purpose of an education should be to follow the passions that you find in your experience of life. That's what humans do best, in my opinion, anyway. My humble opinion.
Great, thank you. And if there was a magic wand to solve some of the barriers to providing a more progressive approach to education, Alice asks, what do you think a national curriculum or approach could look like?
I think one of the things which I really felt as I was writing this presentation and all the research I've done over the years is that a mass education system can never truly be a one size fits all. Um, as much as I'd love to wave a magic wand and make that so, I honestly think it would take such a huge amount of expense. You need an awful lot of staff, and like staff to child ratios would need to be improved drastically, which is impossible when they can't even keep up reasonably with the teachers that are required for the numbers they've got, and with the funding that they've got available. But truthfully, that's very difficult. And again, we have to remember that we're operating within a country that has a huge expenditure, a huge population that they're trying to serve. Um, and we can all argue about where money should be being spent and where it's being wasted until we're blue in the face. But ultimately, there is only so much money and there is only so much that we can do. And I think that ultimately, whilst parents obviously have been grateful for the opportunity for state schooling in the past, more of us are reaching a point where we have either enough financial independence or education ourselves or alternative progressive ideas that we're able to seek out other options for our children that suit us better. And the truth is that realistically, where possible, if we can help to fund and support more alternative options where we can, it ultimately allows for more options to be available for our kids in the long term. Because where they're better funded, they have more opportunity to take in children who can't be funded into them, etc. as well. So I think there's a lot of argument to be said there for diversity, that we can't always create a mass system that's going to serve everyone. But I think we have to be ready to approach education with a diverse outlook and with allowing different values and beliefs to come to the surface.
Great, thank you. And Annalise was asking how she can get in contact with you. Could she do that through
Yeah,
your podcast webpage?
absolutely. You can find me on bighomedpodcast.com, or if you search for Kelly Rigg ADHD coaching, you'll also find me there as well. So yeah, but the podcast is probably better known, so you'll find me a bit easier through that one.
Great, thank you. So I guess we should wrap up there then. But thank you so much for your time. That was absolutely fascinating. And I think it's so important when we want to bring about change to look back and understand why we are where we are and to have that context. So thank you so much for
Yeah,
doing that for us today.
that's okay.
Um, I'm just going to stop recording.